CGTN, China Global Television Network.
When it comes to natural resources, Africa is far from lacking. The continent produces about 40% of the world's gold, supplies 12% of its oil, and is home to 60% of the global uncultivated arable land. However, most of Africa's resources are traded unprocessed. When comparing with the tremendous wealth the finished products generate, very little benefit is brought to the continent, with more than 30% of its people still living in extreme poverty. The question then is it possible for African countries to scale up value addition locally and export finished products? I am Liu Feifei. Welcome to Talk Africa. Africa is indeed full of untapped riches, yet the region has struggled to truly realize its potential. Let's take a brief look at some of Africa's key exports in figures and what Africa gets in return.
Since independence, African countries have been striving to climb up the value chain, but their efforts are yet to bear fruit, with many African economies still heavily reliant on the export of unprocessed raw materials, getting very little from the value they generate. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are the two largest cocoa producers in the world. Cote d'Ivoire alone produces 30% of the world's cocoa, with a total production of 1.5 million tons annually. Now, global chocolate production is a profitable industry that generates $100 billion annually, but only 2% of this value is returned to the home-producing countries and even less to the farmers. It's a similar story when we look at crude oil production in Africa. Nigeria produces just under 2 million barrels of crude oil per day, and at current oil prices, each sells at about $60. Once the oil is refined though, the different byproducts are worth around $600 per barrel. This means that Nigeria could be earning 10 times more than what it does now, were it fully processing its own oil. Africa is also famed for its world-class tea and coffee, with Kenya being one of the world's leading exporters of both. In 2017, Kenya earned $1.2 billion from its tea exports. However, even with world tea prices rising to over $3 a kilo, farmers only received 50 cents per kilogram, despite hours of back-breaking work required to produce it.
And joining me in the studio in Nairobi, we have Anzetsi Were, a development economist. In Beijing, we have Professor He Wenping, Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Science. And in Lagos, we have Gabriel Idahosa, an economist and the Vice President of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you all for joining us at Talk Africa today. Anzetsi, let's begin with you. Can you tell us what is the current status of the African exports composition?
I think primarily when you look at the composition of exports coming from Africa, you'll find that a lot of it is agricultural commodities that are very low level in their levels of processing. You'll also find a lot of metals and minerals, and then you'll find fuels, particularly oil. And one of the key definers is our inability to process them to more sophisticated products. And the reason why that's a problem is because we are not able to value add to a level that makes the product more profitable. But also the real problem with trading in commodities is that those commodities prices really fluctuate. One of the biggest things that hit Africa over the past few years is the drop in oil prices. And you saw a lot of countries such as Nigeria, Angola, South Sudan, who are big oil exporters, really get knock-ons in terms of their budgets and in terms of the amount of revenue they earn. So it's really important that we start to shift away from those commodities to products that we have a bit more control over the pricing of them.
And indeed, one of the ways to do that is by adding value to some of those products as an interim phase. But let's take a step back and let's talk about cocoa, for example. Ghana is a major exporter of cocoa beans, which is the main ingredient used in the making of chocolate. Now, Ghana's President Akufo-Addo recently has said it is unacceptable that even though we produce in West Africa 65% of the cocoa beans in the world, we earn only between 3.5 and 6% of the final price of a chocolate bar. Value addition, therefore, is imperative if we are to maximize the potential to pursue resource-based industrialization. Gabriel, let me turn to you. What can Ghana do to go from a cocoa bean exporter to a chocolate bar producer?
The cocoa situation in Ghana really applies to all commodities, and it has to do with technology and investment capital. For you to process cocoa into chocolates, there is technology at various levels, and you need the investment capital to build the processing plants. Both in case of technology and investment capital, Ghana, like most other African countries, do not have enough of these two major requirements. And so the technology that you require to process these commodities comes from essentially the education system. So the education system needs to be addressed in terms of the quality and the numbers, the quantity of technicians and engineering graduates that can feed these processing facilities. And then you need investment capital to build these facilities. And behind the lack of investment capital is very low savings because of the general state of poverty. So you do not have, in most African countries, a strong investment capital that flows from a very high level of investment and savings. So long as we have the level of poverty that we have, and we are unable to build significant savings, then we do not have a stock of investment capital. And
Professor He, if I can ask you to jump in here for a moment, what are your thoughts about how Africa can begin to add value to its raw materials? Is it the poverty, education, and investments that are needed?
Yeah, I fully agree with my colleague's opinion. Even though there are plenty of those raw material in African countries, but African countries are very short of those technical know-how and management skill, and of course those financial resources, and plus those human resources, those skillful workers. So all those elements, I think none of them are shortfall, and then you can make those value, the value added. Those you need to climb up those value-added chain, but you need to do all those things from the beginning. For example, like I visited a chocolate museum, like in the Frankfurt. So all those chocolate making process from the very beginning, those are cocoa, and then so a step, another step. So it's a quite complicated process. So all those process, yeah, this is a development. Even in the Western countries, like making all those things from raw material to the final products, it takes ages, to develop all different kinds of skill and a very complicated process. So industrialization is the process to transform those raw material advantage now becoming those producing competitive advantage. Because Africa, I think hope is there, potential is there, because first the youth generation, this is a continent, has a potential and plenty of those working force. By the year 2050, I think 1 out of the 10, those workforce, maybe even 3 out of 10 are coming from Africa. So other places, maybe they're facing those aged society, but only Africa still has those very big, large, those human resources there.
These hurdles that Africa is facing today, in fact, they were not the case in the beginning, in the 60s and the 70s, when a number of African nations were gaining their independence, there was actually a path towards industrialization. What was the shift that took place after the 70s?
I think there are several things that happened. I think one of the biggest stories in Africa that really led to our deindustrialization were the structural adjustment programs and the forced liberalization of our economies. One of the reasons the 60s and 70s were thriving is because we had fairly protected economies where we were making products that we wanted to consume in terms of import substitution policies and these other things. But towards the 80s and 90s, we were pushed into structural adjustment programs where a lot of government funding was cut, and then private sector was expected to drive, but there was no money really to get it done. So I think one of the broadest problems is that the liberalization of our economies happened too early, where we didn't have a sufficiently large and stable manufacturing body to then drive products into the region and internationally. So I feel that we opened our markets prematurely.
That's interesting. Now, Professor He, at around the same time, in fact, in the late 70s and early 80s, China also began a process of opening up. What are some comparisons that you can draw from the China example and the example here in Africa?
Oh, yes. I think comparing with Africa, actually China has short of those raw materials, because even though we have a large size of territory, but majority of them, they are not the desert in the western of the China. So raw material is not that rich like African countries has. But with those opening and reform policy, like we set up, lots of those special economic zone around those coastal cities in the east part of China, and we offer those preferential policy to attract those top 5, those international level, high technical, those companies. So those companies set in those special economic zone, they built up those factories and also install all those advanced machine production lines for making those industrialization happens. Through all those process, like Chinese also, those education. I think we have done very good about the education, because this all the family, we have this culture. I think culture this advantage. So no matter you are coming from poor family or like in the mountain areas, those parents, they will do every effort to send their kids in the school. So a lot of very high quality, those engineers graduated from university, they enter into those factories. So this whole process, I think, has been intertwined with each other. Yeah, with those like first level of those industrialization, when everything is ready, and then drive them inside into high level of those industrialization.
Now, Gabriel, before we wrap up on this particular topic, what are your thoughts? Maybe was it that China's liberalization process was internally driven? Do you think that made a definitive difference between the industrialization processes?
Yes. The key thing from the China experience is heavy investment in education, in technical education, in graduate and postgraduate engineering education. In Africa, we are still very far from putting the amount of investment we have to do. When we begin to ramp up the quality and the number of technicians and engineering graduates, you have the very basic requirement for industrialization. Then you can begin to build on that by investing in institutions like development finance institutions that create access to finance, because you have to have finance. If you have the engineering skills and you know what to do and you do not have finance, then you wouldn't go very far. So education and access to finance, those are the two key things that African countries need to significantly invest in to provide the atmosphere for industrialization.
And Zetsi, what are your thoughts on industrialization, the required infrastructure for that?
I mean, as I said, there's a whole ecosystem. One of the biggest problems we're having in Africa, beyond what my colleagues have said, is that one of the things China is good at is that it has the different infrastructure in terms of road transport and energy, but it also has in terms of inputs and accessories that are contributing to the final product. Beyond what my colleagues have mentioned, another big issue is infrastructure in terms of transport infrastructure and power infrastructure. One of the biggest costs for a lot of manufacturers in Kenya or in the region, for example, with the exception maybe of Ethiopia, is electricity electricity. So there are certain things that private sector can do and try to drive the industrialization process. But when the fundamental building blocks are not being put in place, such as education, technology, infrastructure, and skills, then private sector can try what it wants. But there's some foundations that I think should be the focus of the conversation.
On that note, let's take a short break. When we come back, we will continue this discussion on how to value add in Africa. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue our conversation about Africa's way forward in value addition with our panel of experts. In Nairobi, we have Anzetsi Were, development economist. In Beijing, we have Professor He Wenping, Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And in Lagos, we have Gabriel Itahosa, an economist and the Vice President of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Now, before the break, we were talking about how to value add in Africa. Let's continue with this line of questions. When Africa was making progress towards industrialization in the 60s and 70s, how can we at this point continue on that path? Gabriel, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we have to start from the very first stages. If we cannot process whatever the commodity, whether it's cocoa or oil, to the final product, there's a lot of intermediate processing that we can do. We can start from intermediate processing before we export. We can also start from small-scale industrial levels of industrialization. There are a lot of supply chain products that are small-scale, that do not require a very large capital and technology to do. Whether it's a car, whether it's an aircraft, there are very small items in those large complex equipment that can be produced with small capital, with high technology, and low entry level. We have to look at those low entry level points in various industrial sectors.
Professor He, let's start with you also on this question. How would you recommend, if we were to take a snapshot of Africa today, how would you recommend that Africa continue on its growth of industrialization?
I think there are lots of things African countries now need to do. First, like my colleagues mentioned, infrastructure, because without a very stable supply of this power, like electricity, like all those transportation means, and then it's not easy to talk about how to make those value added to those raw material. Because when the machines has been moved in the factory, so when everything producing line is ready there, it needs power, it needs electricity. So if electricity has been frequently cut, so that's not easy to talk about how to make those products, final products happening. So infrastructure, exactly that's the thing now China has been doing in Africa together with African countries. So with that, another, I will repeat it again, that's the very skillful human resources, working force, because everything needs person, needs human being to finish it, to do it. Even though there's very good machine are there, but if there's short of those technicians, to run those machines, to maintain those machines, it's not make things happening as well. So one is infrastructure, transportation. Another is, I think, those very skillful workforce. I think, of course, another things we also need, like a very peaceful environment, stable policy, and very visionable leadership, So all the countries should be united together. So consistency of the policy and the whole process cannot be, from sometimes stopped and then suspended. So that will cut those chain of the
I
development.
believe your point is that infrastructure development is very much needed. And Zitzi, this is something that you've mentioned earlier, which is the need for the government's involvement in this. Now, the African heads of state clearly understand this. And I believe the African Union also understands the urgency with which Africa needs to start value adding. What is stopping this from happening?
I think that's an important question because, frankly, a lot of African countries are democracies and are caught in 5-year electoral cycles. And one of the problems with electoral cycles that are 5 years long is that it makes it very difficult to plan. If you look at how China industrialized, or Singapore, even Japan or South Korea, even countries in the global north, there was a certain level of political stability that facilitated that happening. Now, one of the problems with Africa is that we're a young economy and we're a young democracy. Now, when you're both a young economy and a young democracy, they tend to feed into each other. If you look at countries such as China, they have their political situation, their political stability, and so really politics doesn't interfere with the technocratic realities of policy making or driving government strategy or getting things done. In Africa, we have the opposite problem where everybody is distracted with policies and politics and who's president and who's this and who's that. And what I don't see in Africa that we must shift is shifting to let the technocrats have a bit more of a say on the path that our country goes on. Yes, you can have the politicians who have their vision, like the AU has its vision and all these politicians have its vision, but it is absolutely crucial that the technocrats step in and actually implement that vision and make that vision a reality. So I think one of the broader problems from a political point of view is that we don't take technocrats very seriously in Africa. We still see them as a pawn in the political game. And I think that shouldn't be the case. Technocrats should be front and center in driving the industrialization agenda because we understand what the issues are and we have some good ideas on how to push it forward. But as long as politics takes center stage in Africa, we'll have a tough time.
In addition to looking internally at the technocrats, at the rise of the technocrats, are there other things that Africa can do in terms of working with its investment partners to maybe ask for value addition in the process of making exports?
I think one of the things that we need to take a bit of a step back, if you look at the value addition that Africa should really be focused on, it tends to be light manufacturing. So one of the problems with our manufacturing is that we do not link it to agriculture. If you look at leather or textiles or furniture or all of these light manufacturing, everything links to agriculture. So we cannot really have a conversation about manufacturing in Kenya or in Africa without the agricultural production component. So there needs to be a lot of modernization in agriculture to get the scale of inputs that can then drive the manufacturing. So we can't just have a siloed conversation without linking that to the agricultural question.
They're all interconnected.
That's right.
And Professor He, to you in Beijing, now China has been saying that its strategic vision with Africa is one of a win-win partnership. What has China done to help Africa in its quest for value addition?
Oh yes, China has always attached great importance to Africa. Especially after 2008, this global financial crisis. Actually, if we pay a little attention to those growth rate regions in whole of the world, we find only the Asian continent and the African continent, now they have continued enjoyed, relatively speaking, very good economic growth situation. So why is that? Because mutually serving as the engine for each other's economic growth. For China, we also need that market in Africa. We also need to, have those resources like import from Africa, and Africa also need those investment and the financial means and also technical know-how to Africa. So this is mutually complementary with each other. That's exactly now China has been continuously doing. Now we are doing on two engines. One is infrastructure construction. So a lot of railway now has been under construction in Africa. Last year we have built this Mombasa to Nairobi railway, and then another railway from Addis Ababa to Djibouti has been finalized as well. Now in Nigeria, like in Southern Africa, so everywhere in the port, like a power generation station, and this is one thing. Another is those industrial zone. Because industrialization, you need newer those Chinese and also other countries, those those entrepreneurs. They invested there for making those like the light industry, manufacturing industry to produce, maybe first started from those light products.
How can Africa protect its fledgling industries if we develop one at that, while at the same time becoming a member of the global trade order?
It's a very tricky question because we're not technically allowed to protect our markets with unfair tariffs. But I think one of the things that we can do from a very practical point of view is look at the gaps that do exist in tariffs that we can leverage a bit more strategically. If you look at specific value chains such as leather or construction materials, there are very clear little shifts we can make in terms of tariff structures that can really help boost that product line and that value chain from really developing. So I think there needs to be a very detailed process where African governments sit with the private sector and do a tariff review that then gives solid direction on how we can now build an ecosystem of policy that drives forward industrialization.
Thank you. This has been very insightful. We are unfortunately just about out of time. I have one final question, which I would like to pose to each one of you out there. Now, industrialization and value addition is a complicated process, and it's going to take some time to achieve that. But in the meanwhile, for now, what can we do for the farmers and the miners of Africa to give them a better quality of life? Gabriel, let us start with you on that one.
I think we should concentrate on simple, low-cost technologies to improve productivity in our farms and in our mines. Low-cost technology that is affordable within our current technology capacity, and low-cost technology available within the in-country in most countries. I think that is an area we can immediately make an impact if we focus and develop these low-cost technologies for which we have sufficient technicians and engineers and can afford to produce them in-country. That would be a good place to start.
Professor He, what are your thoughts on this?
I think we should further explore those potential coming from African countries, being the latecomer. But you have a lot of advantages. For example, you can jump in from those fixed phone using and come all the way to the 4G and even 5G, those satellite, those internet users. So share those information and to the people, even to the mountainous area, rural area, they will catch up very quickly. So with information sharing, and then we will see a lot of potential has been discovered.
And Zetsi, you have the last word. Your thoughts?
I think one of the things we need to do in terms of our farmers is help them run their farms more efficiently. One of the biggest problems with the fact that they get a low amount of money for their product is often their product is not at the highest standard. So I think one of the things for farmers in particular is get them the inputs and the support required to increase the quality of their product first of all, help them get into niche markets that allow and get them to pay a better price for their product like fair trade and organic. But I think ultimately it's really about getting agricultural extension services from government to help people run their farms better and in a more profitable manner.
Thank you, Nzeti Were, development economist who is with me here in the Nairobi studio. And a big thank you to our panel of experts, starting with our Beijing expert, Professor He Wenping, who is the Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And in Lagos, Gabriel Idahosa, an economist and the Vice President of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. I am Liu Feifei, and until next time, goodbye.